Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just gave out all my national awards for this upcoming year. I think Texas probably dominates some of those defensive awards, including the Butkus and the Nagurski Award. I think Jeremiah Smith finally gets the Biletnikoff he probably shouldn't gotten last year. And I'm going to take Cade Klubnik to win the Heisman Trophy this year. I think the schedule sets up incredibly. I think the trio of wide receivers is about as good as you're going to find in the country. And the comfortability in this offense is, again, about as good as you're going to find in the country in a country full of new quarterbacks. But let's get into my CFP predictions. I put it off long enough. I am very nervous about these picks because at the end of the day, I don't think anyone's fully confident in their CFP picks right now. If they tell you they're fully confident, they are lying to you. I'm just going to be plainly honest with you. But at the end of the day, this is the way I see this thing breaking down. I'm going to go Clemson as the number one team in the country as the undefeated ACC champion. I really do think the schedule sets up incredibly nice for them. I think they run the table. I think they are a 12-0 team at this point, or 13-0 team at this point. I think they get the one seed, much like Oregon did a year ago, and they get a tough matchup against a possible incredible matchup between Georgia and Utah that we'll get to here in a second. My number two seed, Alabama. I think they win the SEC. I think they are the number two seed in the entire country. I think they're going to have an incredible year. I think so many people are writing off a guy that was in the national championship game not 18 months ago, and Kalen DeBoer, an incredible head coach. I understand the questions around Ty Simpson. I have some of those questions as well. I still think he'll be able to put together an incredible year. I think the wide receiver core is as good as you're going to find in the country. I think the offensive line, the exact same, and the defense, going to be a nightmare and give them a lot of short fields to work with. I think they win the SEC. I think they're the number two seed in the country. I think Ohio State fits into the number three. I think they win the Big Ten this year, but I do think they have a little bit of a rocky road to get there. Now, that Texas game is going to be really interesting because let's say Texas were to win that opening week game at Ohio State, but then Ohio State were to run the table and beat Penn State in the Big Ten championship, and then Penn State, let's say they're undefeated at the point of the Big Ten championship game, or I guess that wouldn't make sense. Let's say Ohio State loses to Penn State the first time around, and then they find their way to a rematch, and Ohio State wins that one. Would Texas bump up to the three spot? Would Ohio State jump over Texas, who had beaten them earlier in the year? It's a very complicated situation. I'm going to go with Ohio State 3, and then I'm going to go with Penn State 4. The loser of the Big Ten championship, I think they could go into that thing undefeated. I think this team is going to be very good this year. I think they're going to miss some of that big-time game stuff that they've missed the past number of years. So I do think there's going to be a little of that missing from Penn State this upcoming year. I still think they're one of the top four seeds in the country because I think they might be undefeated going into that Big Ten championship game. The seeding here is going to be really tough. I think by the end of the year, especially if you add a Clemson into this thing, I think the SEC and the Big Ten runner-ups are going to be battling for that fourth spot. I just think Penn State wins out in this one because I don't think they have a regular season loss going into that Big Ten championship, as crazy as that might sound for even some Penn State fans out there, frankly. But I think those are your top four seeds. When you get into the 5 seed, I'm going to go with Texas here. They're the runner-up in the SEC championship to me. I think they very well could be one of those top 4 seeds, but I'm going to go with them at the number 5. They're going to face off against Tulane, my number 12 seed. A little bit of complicated seeding here, but at the end of the day, I do think Texas will slot in here as the SEC title loser. I think it'll be a really complicated situation, but I'm going to have Texas at 5, facing Tulane. They get them on their home turf. I think they dominate this game. It'll be not quite as or a little bit more aggressive, frankly, than I think the Clemson game was a year ago for Texas, but I do think Texas gets this win over Tulane. They move on to the next round. Then you have a Notre Dame against Oregon game. Oregon fits in here at the 11 seed. I think they're going to be the team that makes everyone mad. I think at the end of the year, they're going to play Washington. I have Washington winning that game right now, and I think they're going to fall to 10-2, and everyone's going to lose their minds. I think there's going to be an Arizona State team over in the Big 12 that feels like they deserve to be in after losing to Utah in the Big 12 championship. I think you're going to have a team over maybe in the ACC, a Georgia Tech team that maybe is 10-3 at the time, with 2 losses to Clemson and 1 loss to Georgia, and saying, we absolutely deserve to be in this thing. I think there's going to be a number of teams, maybe a Florida team or an Oklahoma team that's 9-3 in the SEC. I think there's going to be a lot of teams that have an argument for that last spot. I think a 10-2 Oregon wins those arguments in a lot of respects. So I'm going to go with Oregon in that spot. I'm not huge on the Ducks this year, but I think they find their way into the field as the 11 seed and make a lot of people mad in the process. I'll just leave it at that for the time being. That's the one that I fought myself a ton on. There were a ton of different teams that I slotted into that 11 spot, but I'm going to go with Oregon 2, have a really solid year with a couple of big time mistakes, and I think at the end of the day they slot into 11. They play a Notre Dame team at number 6 as far as I'm concerned. I think they're going to suffer one loss in the regular season is Notre Dame, but at the end of the day I think they find their way into the field very comfortably, and I think they play an Oregon team that's going to be really good. I think going up against this back end is going to be really tough for Dante Moore, who's a very talented kid, still going to be very young in his college football career in terms of playing. I think Oregon loses this game to Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame moves on to the next round. Then you have LSU against Washington, a very interesting game. Washington comes down to Baton Rouge to play Brian Kelly and the Tigers. I think LSU takes care of business in this one. And I think LSU is going to be a team that really finds their stride late in the season. Maybe they lose that Alabama game, they lose the Clemson game to start the year, but then around week 7, week 8, maybe a little bit later, they find their stride, the defense really starts playing well, and they become one of those teams that's going to be a nightmare to deal with once you get into the CFP. I think they win this game against Washington. I think Damon Williams has a lot of magic going into this game and just falls a little bit short once you get to this one. But going to be an incredible matchup. Cannot wait for those two. Well, hopefully wait for those two to finally match up at the end of the day. But an incredible matchup in round 1 if we were to get it. I think LSU finds a way to move on. And then Georgia against Utah, another one that I don't think anyone was expecting to see. But in the 12-team playoff, you can see a number of really weird things. Georgia sits where Ohio State did a year ago. I think a team that really was struggling early on in the year, or not even really struggling, but had a couple of moments where they had some hiccups, and then they find their stride, and they become a really tough team to beat. When you have Utah coming to Athens, when you have Kirby Smart in the playoff, I'm going to lean towards Kirby Smart in a lot of respects. So I'm going to go with Georgia here. I think they find their stride late in the season, and I think they move on to the quarters. Well, they'll play a Clemson team that they're very familiar with, at least from last season, that is. But let's get into the quarters here. And we'll start up in the left corner. Clemson against Georgia, 1-8, the same situation that Oregon was in a year ago when Ohio State came to the Rose Bowl and they ended up facing off. It's going to be a weird one. It's a rematch of Week 1 in 2024 where Georgia totally dominated the matchup. I think Clemson's going to be a much better team this year. I also think Georgia just has the physicality that's going to be too much to handle. I think Clemson's a very good football team. I think there is a gap between them and some of the SEC and Big Ten teams when you come down to the trenches. I think Georgia ends up winning that battle. I think they move on to the semifinals. I think they are the 8 seed, much like Ohio State was a year ago, that finds its way to the semifinals and just looks like a buzzsaw doing it. I think Clemson is a very good team. I think Georgia has found their stride by this point, and I think that defensive line is just a nightmare for that offensive line to deal with, and it looks a little bit like that Texas-Clemson game did a year ago. Then you got Alabama-LSU, a rematch from the middle of the season that I think Alabama's probably going to win. I think LSU gets this one. I'll be totally honest with you. I think the LSU defense is going to find a way to develop a ton throughout the season. I think they're going to make a couple of big-time plays here. I think Alabama, while going to be a very good team throughout the year, I think there's going to be a moment where Ty Simpson or this offense being a little bit younger than it normally is, especially at the quarterback position, makes one mistake, makes 1 or 2 mistakes in those big-time moments throughout the season. I think they have big-time moments where they make big-time plays. And then this one, I think they fall a little bit short. I think LSU moves on to the semifinals. As crazy as that sounds, I think this is going to be the team to beat, and I think Alabama is going to really struggle in this matchup. Then you got number 3 Ohio State against number 6 Notre Dame, a national title rematch. I think everyone would love to see this one this upcoming year. I think this one comes down to quarterback play as well, and I think Ohio State has the guy that I feel more confident in, regardless of it's C.J. Carr or Kenny Minchey. I think Notre Dame's fighting an uphill battle at that quarterback position. I think it's going to be really tough to play to the level as some of the other teams will have their quarterbacks playing at. And I think at the end of the day, Ohio State is going to find their groove throughout this season and be a really tough out by the end of it, obviously with them beating Penn State in the Big Ten championship. And Penn State draws the short stick in this scenario. They get Texas, the number 5 seed. I think they lose. I'll be totally honest with you. I think when you look at this Penn State team, they have so many incredible things going for them. I still can't get over when Drew Aller has guys in his face and there's a number of big-time players on the back end. I still think there's going to be those couple of mistakes. I think Drew Aller is going to be a much better player this year and play some really good football and lead them to at least Big Ten title berth for the second year in a row. I think they're going to win some big-time games against Ohio State at home, against Oregon at home. I think they're going to get to this point and they're going to make a couple of mistakes, and this Texas team especially this defense, is just going to be too much to handle for Drew Aller, for this Penn State offense. I'm going to go with Texas to win this game, and frankly, the Penn State fans get very, very mad at James Franklin, and we'll see how that develops throughout the offseason. But at the end of the day, I think Penn State's going to be one of those teams that seems to be rolling right along, like kind of like Oregon was a year ago, and then it just falls a little bit short towards the end of the year. They lose to Texas in the quarterfinals, and we got a semifinal of Georgia, LSU, Texas, and Ohio State. You got 3 SEC teams here, and frankly, I feel a little bit weird about it, but at the end of the day, I do think this is the way it's going to play out, at least as of right now. It's going to be all over the place. I can almost promise you that, but let's start on the left side of the bracket. Number 5 Texas against number 8 Georgia. This will be a rematch of that game that happens in Athens, I believe, later on in the year. November 15th, I believe, is the date on that one, but going to be an incredible, incredible matchup. I'm going to take the quarterback that I think has more upside. I'm going to take Arch Manning. I do think Texas wins this game. I think they make the national title for the first time since 2009. I think this team's going to put it together throughout the year. I think the defense is going to be ready to roll right away. I think they're going to be one of the best defenses in the country right away. I think once Arch Manning puts it together, it's going to be a really, really hard team to stop. They just got news that C.J. Baxter was probably going to play in Week 1 and throughout the year. That is huge for this football team, and I think Texas is going to be a really, really hard out by this time of year. I think they find a way to win this one, even if they lose that one earlier on in the year in Athens. I think they might win that one as well, but at the end of the day, I think Texas wins this game. I think they move on to the national title, and that makes way for Ohio State LSU. This is an incredible matchup. Any time in any iteration of college football, frankly, this is going to be an incredible matchup. I think LSU will do it. As crazy as that sounds, I think when you look at this Ohio State team, there's a million things to like. I think the losses of their 2 coordinators is going to catch up to them at some point. Now, I think they're going to be able to put together a really good year in the meantime. I think Brian Hartline is going to call a really solid offense. I think Matt Patricia is going to find his groove on defense, and they're going to be more than fine. I think there's going to be a moment against an LSU team with a Blake Baker that calls a very exotic, weird defense, and going against a quarterback like Julian Sayin, who will be playing his first CFP games in the first couple of games here. I think LSU finds a way to get this one done. I think they are the team that finds a way to really round in the form late in the year. I think Garrett Nussmeier shines in the CFP, and they find their way to the CFP championship. I think it's Texas against LSU for the national title, as crazy as that might sound right now. I think Texas plays LSU for the national title, an all-SEC national title. I feel as iffy about this pick as I probably would about just about every single national title pick I would have had. So I don't think this one's as crazy as some people might think it is. I think this college football year is going to be crazy. At the end of it all, I think these 2 teams are going to be incredible. I think Arch Manning and Garrett Nussmeier are going to be 2 of the best quarterbacks in the entire country. I think the defenses will round into form. Now, I don't think Texas really has to, but I think LSU is going to have a ton of firepower on offense. I think Caden Durham's going to kind of come into his own throughout the year and become a very good running back for this team. At the end of the day, I think there is a lot going into this matchup. When I really break it down, when I go into the nitty-gritty, I find my way back to the number 1 team in the country right now. I think the Texas Longhorns win the national title, and it sounds a little bit crazy as I'm saying it because they've been out of that picture for quite some time. They found their way back in the last couple of years, no doubt about it, and then they've fallen short. And it's been partly Sark's fault, partly Quinn Ewers' fault, partly just a number of different things falling the opposite direction for Texas. When I look at this team right now, I see a defense that I think is going to be the very best in the entire country. I see a wide receiver core that, while unproven right now, I think Ryan Wingo is going to become one of the biggest stars in the entire college football world this year. I think Arch Manning rounds into his own around week 3, week 4, and really finds a stride and is incredibly, incredibly hard to stop. I think this offensive line is going to find its groove throughout the year. I think the run game is going to be a nightmare with C.J. Baxter finding his way back to the field. I think Texas wins its first national title in 20 years. I think they find their way back to the top of the sport. It's going to be a really, really interesting road. I think you're going to have a number of teams that find their way into this thing. I think you could have a Texas team going into the playoff that maybe didn't even play in the SEC championship and then finds their way through. I think there's so many teams, whether you want to talk about Texas or LSU or an Oregon team up in the Big Ten or maybe even an Arizona State team down in the Big 12, that can find their stride late in the season and find their way to the championship game. I don't know how many can actually win it. I think there's probably 6, 7, maybe 8 teams that can really win the national title. When I break it down and I think about it every which way, I find my way back to Texas just about every time. I think the defense is going to be a nightmare. I think the pass rush is going to get after every single quarterback that they are going to play. And I think Arch Manning is going to be incredible. I don't think he's going to be this Heisman winner that everyone seems to demand that he is in some respects, but I do think he is a guy that's going to put it together. I think the talent is totally undeniable. I think Ryan Wingo is one of the best players in the entire country this year, and we've talked about the defense plenty. I think Colin Simmons is a nightmare, Ethan Burke on the other side as well, Anthony Hill in the middle, and then Michael Taff and all those guys on the back end. I think Texas wins the national title, and I think there's a lot of people that are probably going to make that pick. At the end of the day, they're the number one team in the country for a reason going into this year. I think the defense is going to be as good as you're going to find over really the past couple of years in the college football world, going back maybe to those Georgia teams. I think they're going to be an absolute nightmare defensively, and I'm not going to bet against Arch Manning. I'm just not. I think that player is an incredibly, incredibly talented kid. I think he's going to keep his head down. I think he's not going to get caught up in the noise, and he's going to make a number of big-time plays for this team. So I'm going to go with Texas to win the national title, as weird as that might sound after the probably 15 or 20 years that they've had a little bit down. I think they find their way back to the top of the sport in their 20th anniversary of that 2005 victory with Vince Young. I think Texas wins the national title this year, and I don't feel confident. And I think that's the great thing about this college football season. If anyone tells you that they feel super confident in their college football championship pick, they're probably lying to you or they're lying to themselves. So at the end of the day, it'll be really interesting to watch all of this unfold. I think we're going to have one of the crazier years in recent memory. I think last year was all over the place. I think this year is going to kick it up a notch. And although all of that craziness will happen, I think the number one team at the beginning of the year finds a way to be the number one team at the end of the year, and the Texas Longhorns win the national title. And I'm already talking myself out of it. But at the end of the day, that's what I'm going to go with right now. I will stake my claim on that, and we will see how that develops over the next little bit. But thank you so much for tuning in. Definitely do like, subscribe, comment, do all of that good stuff. Means the world to me. On Wednesday, we'll get into all of the fall camp stuff you need to know, a number of quarterbacks being named all around the country. We will get into all of that stuff. We will preview Farmageddon this upcoming weekend. We'll get into Iowa State, Kansas State, a huge game in the Big 12 to kick off week 0. We'll get into all the craziness. There is going to be a number of things to break down before this thing kicks off in just 5 days here. So cannot wait for this thing to get going. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please like, comment, subscribe, do all of that good stuff. Means the world to me. But I'll go with Texas Longhorns to win the national title, and we'll see how that develops throughout the year. But thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday.